The 100 Days, sometimes known as the 100 Days of Napoleon or Napoleon's 100 Days, marked the period between Napoleon's return from exile on the island of Elba to Paris on 20 March 1815 and the second restoration of King Louis XVIII on 8 July 1815. This period saw the War of the Seventh Coalition, and includes the Waterloo Campaign, the Neapolitan War as well as several other minor campaigns. The phrase «les Seigneurs» was first used by the prefect of Paris, Gaspard, Comte de Chabrol, in his speech welcoming the king back to Paris on 8 July. Napoleon returned while the Congress of Vienna was sitting. On 13 March, 7 days before Napoleon reached Paris, the powers at the Congress of Vienna declared him an outlaw, and on 25 March Austria, Prussia, Russia and the United Kingdom, members of the Seventh Coalition, bound themselves to put 150,000 men each into the field to end his rule. This set the stage for the last conflict in the Napoleonic Wars, the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, the restoration of the French monarchy for the second time and the permanent exile of Napoleon to the distant island of St. Helena, where he died in May 1821. Background: Napoleon's rise and fall. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars pitted France against various coalitions of other European nations nearly continuously from 1792 onward. The overthrow and subsequent execution of Louis XVI in France had greatly disturbed other European leaders, who vowed to crush the French Republic. Rather than leading to France's defeat, the wars allowed the revolutionary regime to expand beyond its borders and create client republics. The success of the French forces made a hero out of their best commander, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, Napoleon staged a successful coup d'état and became first consul of the new French consulate. 5 years later, he crowned himself Emperor Napoleon I. The rise of Napoleon troubled the other European powers as much as the earlier revolutionary regime had. Despite the formation of new coalitions against him, Napoleon's forces continued to conquer much of Europe. The tide of war began to turn, however, after a disastrous French invasion of Russia in 1812 that caused Napoleon to lose much of his army. The following year, during the War of the Sixth Coalition, coalition forces defeated the French in the Battle of Leipzig. Following its victory at Leipzig, the coalition vowed to press on to Paris and oppose Napoleon. In the last week of February 1814, Prussian Field Marshal Blücher advanced on Paris. After multiple attacks, maneuvering, and reinforcements on both sides, Blücher won the Battle of Laon in early March 1814. This victory prevented the Allied army from being pushed north out of France. The Battle of Reims went to Napoleon, but this victory was followed by successive defeats from increasingly overwhelming odds. Coalition forces entered Paris after the Battle of Montmartre on 30 March 1814. On 6 April 1814, Napoleon abdicated his throne, leading to the accession of Louis XVIII and the First Bourbon Restoration a month later. The defeated Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Tuscany, while the victorious coalition sought to redraw the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. Exile in Elba. Napoleon spent only 9 months and 21 days in uneasy retirement on Elba, watching events in France with great interest as the Congress of Vienna gradually gathered. He had been escorted to Elba by Sir Neil Campbell, who remained in residence there while performing other duties in Italy, but was not Napoleon's jailer. As he foresaw, the shrinkage of the great empire into the realm of Old France caused intense dissatisfaction among the French, a feeling fed by stories of the tactless way in which the Bourbon princes treated veterans of the Grande Armée and the returning royalist nobility treated the people at large. Equally threatening was the general situation in Europe, which had been stressed and exhausted during the previous decades of near-constant warfare. The conflicting demands of major powers were for a time so exorbitant as to bring the powers at the Congress of Vienna to the verge of war with each other. Thus every scrap of news reaching remote Elba looked favorable to Napoleon to retake power, as he correctly reasoned the news of his return would cause a popular rising as he approached. He also reasoned that the return of French prisoners from Russia, Germany, Britain and Spain would furnish him instantly with a trained, veteran and patriotic army far larger than that which had won renown in the years before 1814. So threatening were the symptoms that the royalists at Paris and the plenipotentiaries at Vienna talked of deporting him to the Azores or to St. Helena, while others hinted at assassination. Congress of Vienna. At the Congress of Vienna, the various participating nations had very different and conflicting goals. Tsar Alexander of Russia had expected to absorb much of Poland and to leave a Polish puppet state, the Duchy of Warsaw, as a buffer against further invasion from Europe. The renewed Prussian state demanded all of the Kingdom of Saxony. Austria wanted to allow neither of these things, while it expected to regain control of northern Italy. Castlereagh, of the United Kingdom, supported France and Austria and was at variance with his own parliament. This almost caused a war to break out when the Tsar pointed out to Castlereagh that Russia had 450,000 men near Poland and Saxony and he was welcome to try to remove them. Indeed, he stated, "I shall be the King of Poland and the King of Prussia will be the King of Saxony." Castlereagh approached King Frederick William III of Prussia to offer him British and Austrian support for Prussia's annexation of Saxony in return for Prussia's support of an independent Poland. Frederick William repeated this offer in public, offending the Tsar so deeply that he challenged Metternich of Austria to a duel. Only the intervention of the Austrian crown stopped it. A breach between the great powers was avoided when members of Britain's parliament got word to the Russian ambassador that Castlereagh had exceeded his authority, and Britain would not support an independent Poland. The affair left Prussia deeply suspicious of any British involvement. Return to France. While the Allies were distracted, Napoleon solved his problem in characteristic fashion. On the 26th of February 1815, when the British and French guard ships were absent, he slipped away from Portoferraio on board the brig Inconstant with some 1,000 men and landed at Gulf Juan between Cannes and Antibes on the 1st of March, 1815. Except in royalist Provence, he was warmly received. He avoided much of Provence by taking a route through the Alps, marked today as the Route Napoléon. Firing no shot in his defense, his troop numbers swelled until they became an army. On the 5th of March, the nominally royalist 5th Infantry Regiment at Grenoble went over to Napoleon en masse. The next day they were joined by the 7th Infantry Regiment under its colonel, Charles de la Bédoyer, who was executed for treason by the Bourbons after the campaign ended. An old anecdote illustrates Napoleon's charisma. When royalist troops deployed to stop the march of Napoleon's force at Grenoble, Napoleon stepped out in front of them, ripped open his coat and said, "If any of you will shoot his emperor, here I am." The men joined his cause. Marshal Ney, now one of Louis XVIII's commanders, had said that Napoleon ought to be brought to Paris in an iron cage, but on the 14th of March, Ney joined Napoleon with 6,000 men. 5 days later, after proceeding through the countryside promising constitutional reform and direct elections to an assembly, to the acclaim of gathered crowds, Napoleon entered the capital, whence Louis XVIII had recently fled. The royalists did not pose a major threat. The Duc d'Angoulême raised a small force in the south, but at Valence it did not provide resistance against imperialists under Grouchy's command, and the Duke, on the 9th of April 1815, signed a convention whereby they received a free pardon from the emperor. The royalists of the Vendée moved later and caused more difficulty for the imperialists. Napoleon's health. The evidence as to Napoleon's health is somewhat conflicting. Carnot, Pasquier, Lavaletta, Thiébaut, and others thought him prematurely aged and enfeebled. At Elba, as Sir Neil Campbell noted, he became an active and proportionately corpulent. There, too, as sometimes in 1815, he began to suffer intermittently from retention of urine, but to no serious extent. For much of his public life, Napoleon was troubled by hemorrhoids, which made sitting on a horse for long periods of time difficult and painful. This condition had disastrous results at Waterloo. During the battle, his inability to sit on his horse for other than very short periods of time interfered with his ability to survey his troops in combat, and thus exercise command. Others saw no marked change in him, while Moline, who knew the emperor well, attributed the lassitude which now and then came over him to a feeling of perplexity caused by his changed circumstances. Constitutional reform at Lyon. On 13 March 1815, Napoleon issued an edict dissolving the existing chambers and ordering the convocation of a national mass meeting, or Champ de Mai, for the purpose of modifying the constitution of the Napoleonic Empire. He reportedly told Benjamin Constant, "I am growing old. The repose of a constitutional king may suit me. It will more surely suit my son." That work was carried out by Benjamin Constant in concert with the emperor. The resulting ACTE additional bestowed on France a hereditary Chamber of Peers, and a Chamber of Representatives elected by the electoral colleges of the empire. According to Chateaubriand, in reference to Louis XVIII's constitutional charter, the new constitution, La Benjamin, it was dubbed, was merely a slightly improved version of the charter associated with Louis XVIII's administration. However, later historians, including Agatha Ram, have pointed out that this constitution permitted the extension of the franchise and explicitly guaranteed press freedom. In the republican manner, the constitution was put to the people of France in a plebiscite, but whether due to lack of enthusiasm, or because the nation was suddenly thrown into military preparation, only 1,532,527 votes were cast. Less than half of the vote in the plebiscites of the consulate. However, the benefit of a large majority meant that Napoleon felt he had constitutional sanction. Napoleon was with difficulty dissuaded from quashing the 3rd of June election of Landunais, the staunch liberal who had so often opposed the emperor, as president of the Chamber of Representatives. In his last communication to them, Napoleon warned them not to imitate the Greeks of the late Byzantine Empire, who engaged in subtle discussions when the ram was battering at their gates. Military mobilization. During the 100 Days both the coalition nations and Napoleon I mobilized for war. Upon reassumption of the throne, Napoleon found that he was left with little by Louis XVIII. There were 56,000 soldiers, of which 46,000 were ready to campaign. By the end of May, the total armed forces available to Napoleon had reached 198,000, with 66,000 more in depots training up but not yet ready for deployment. By the end of May, Napoleon had formed l'Armée Écoutée du Nord, which, led by himself, would participate in the Waterloo campaign. For the defense of France, Napoleon deployed his remaining forces within France with the intention of delaying his foreign enemies while he suppressed his domestic ones. By June the forces were organized thus: 5th Corps, l'Armée Écoutée du Rhin, commanded by Rapp, cantoned near Strasbourg. 7th Corps, l'Armée Écoutée des Alpes, commanded by Suchet, cantoned at Lyon. 1st Corps of Observation, l'Armée Écoutée du Jura, commanded by Lecoulba, cantoned at Belfort. 2nd Corps of Observation, l'Armée Écoutée du VIAF, commanded by Brune, based at Toulon. 3rd Corps of Observation, Army of the Pyrenees Orientales, commanded by Deccan, based at Toulouse. 4th Corps of Observation, Army of the Pyrenees Occidentale, commanded by Clausel, based at Bordeaux. Army of the West, Armée Écoutée de l'Ouest, commanded by Lamarck, was formed to suppress the royalist insurrection in the Vendée region of France, which remained loyal to King Louis XVIII during the 100 Days. Opposing coalition forces, Archduke Charles gathered Austrian and allied German states, while the Prince of Schwarzenberg formed another Austrian army. King Ferdinand VII of Spain summoned British officers to lead his troops against France. Tsar Alexander I of Russia mustered an army of 250,000 troops and sent these rolling toward the Rhine. Prussia mustered two armies. One under Blucher took post alongside Wellington's British army and its allies. The other was the North German Corps under General Kleist, assessed as an immediate threat by Napoleon I. Anglo-Allied, commanded by Wellington, cantoned southwest Brussels, headquartered at Brussels. Prussian army commanded by Blucher, cantoned southeast of Brussels, headquartered at Namur, close to the borders of France but assessed to be less of a threat by Napoleon I. The German Corps, which was part of Blücher's army, but was acting independently south of the main Prussian army. Blucher summoned it to join the main army once Napoleon's intentions became known. The Austrian army of the Upper Rhine, commanded by Field Marshal Karl Philipp, Prince of Schwarzenberg. The Swiss army, commanded by Niklaus Franz von Berkmann. The Austrian army of Upper Italy, Austro-Sardinian army, commanded by Johann Maria Philipp Frémont. The Austrian army of Naples, commanded by Frederick Bianchi, Duke of Casalanza. Other coalition forces which were either converging on France, mobilized to defend the homelands, or in the process of mobilization included a Russian army, commanded by Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly, and marching towards France a reserve Russian army to support de Tolly if required, a reserve Prussian army stationed at home in order to defend its borders, an Anglo-Sicilian army under General Sir Hudson Lowe, which was to be landed by the Royal Navy on the southern French coast. Two Spanish armies were assembling and planning to invade over the Pyrenees. A Netherlands Corps, under Prince Frederick of the Netherlands, was not present at Waterloo, but as a corps in Wellington's army it did take part in minor military actions during the coalition's invasion of France. A Danish contingent known as the Royal Danish Auxiliary Corps commanded by General Prince Frederick of Hesse, and a Hanseatic contingent later commanded by the British Colonel Sir Neil Campbell, were on their way to join Wellington. Both, however, joined the army in July, having missed the conflict. A Portuguese contingent, which due to the speed of events never assembled. War begins. At the Congress of Vienna, the great powers of Europe and their allies declared Napoleon an outlaw, and with the signing of this declaration on 13 March 1815, so began the War of the Seventh Coalition. The hopes of peace that Napoleon had entertained were gone. War was now inevitable. A further treaty was ratified on 25 March in which each of the great European powers agreed to pledge 150,000 men for the coming conflict. Such a number was not possible for Great Britain, as her standing army was smaller than the three of her peers. Besides, her forces were scattered around the globe, with many units still in Canada, where the War of 1812 had recently ceased. With this in mind, she made up her numerical deficiencies by paying subsidies to the other powers and to the other states of Europe that would contribute contingents. Sometime after the Allies began mobilizing, it was agreed that the planned invasion of France was to commence on 1 July 1815. Much later than both Blucher and Wellington would have liked, as both their armies were ready in June, ahead of the Austrians and Russians. The latter were still some distance away. The advantage of this later invasion date was that it allowed all the invading coalition armies a chance to be ready at the same time. Thus they could deploy their combined numerically superior forces against Napoleon's smaller, thinly spread forces, thus ensuring his defeat and avoiding a possible defeat within the borders of France. Yet, this postponed invasion date allowed Napoleon more time to strengthen his forces and defences, which would make defeating him harder and more costly in lives, time and money. Napoleon now had to decide whether to fight a defensive or offensive campaign. Defense would entail repeating the 1814 campaign in France, but with much larger numbers of troops at his disposal. France's chief cities, Paris and Lyon, would be fortified, and two great French armies, the larger before Paris and the smaller before Lyon, would protect them. Francs-tireurs would be encouraged, giving the coalition armies their own taste of guerrilla warfare. Napoleon chose to attack, which entailed a preemptive strike at his enemies before they were all fully assembled and able to cooperate. By destroying some of the major coalition armies, Napoleon believed he would then be able to bring the governments of the Seventh Coalition to the peace table to discuss results favorable to himself, namely peace for France, with himself remaining in power as its head. If peace were rejected by the Allies despite any preemptive military success he might have achieved using the offensive military option available to him, then the war would continue and he could turn his attention to defeating the rest of the coalition armies. Napoleon's decision to attack in Belgium was supported by several considerations. First, he had learned that the British and Prussian armies were widely dispersed and might be defeated in detail. Also, the British troops in Belgium were largely second-line troops. Most of the veterans of the Peninsular War had been sent to America to fight the War of 1812, and, politically, a French victory might trigger a friendly revolution in French-speaking Brussels.